The Bowman Trail through northern Wyoming territory did not forgive November. It had not forgiven October either, not in any year that settlers and drovers and mail riders could agree on. But November was when it stopped being difficult and started being deliberate. The cold came down from Canada, not gradually, but in walls one behind another, each colder than the last. The wind that drove them moving across the high plains with a patience that felt almost considered. Men who had crossed the trail in September spoke of it the way men speak of a river they once swam with the careful respect of someone who understood in their body, rather than their mind, how easily the outcome could have gone the other way. Men who had tried it in November mostly did not speak of it at all, because they had not come back to speak. Three groups had been caught on the Bowman in November of 1884. One of those groups had included 7 men experienced drovers who had worked this country for years, who knew the signs and knew the territory, and who had been caught nonetheless the way the trail caught people, regardless of what they knew, because knowing and surviving were not always the same category. 2 of those men had made it to a line shack 8 kilometers east of the trail and had lived. The other 5 had not made it anywhere. They were found in the spring, distributed across a kilometer of open ground in the positions in which they had died, some of them still standing against their horses, because the cold had been fast enough that sitting down had not become available to them as an option. This was the story people told about the Bowman Trail in November. They told it not to frighten each other, but because it was accurate. And in a country where the distance between accuracy and survival was sometimes very small, accuracy was the kind of information you passed on. Idella Crane knew the story. She had known it when she left Billings. She had known it on the first day out when the sky was clear and the cold was sharp but manageable, the gray mule moving at his steady, indifferent pace along the frozen ruts that passed for a road. She had known it on the second day when the wind picked up from the northwest and held there, and on the third when she crossed the Tongue River on ice that groaned under the wagon's weight but held. She had known it every morning when she broke camp in the dark, fingers stiff inside her gloves, before she'd finished tightening the harness every evening, when she stopped and built a fire small enough to be useful, but not large enough to draw attention, because she was a woman alone on a trail that men avoided, and the cold was not the only thing moving through Wyoming in November. She was 31 years old, dark hair kept pinned without ceremony, brown eyes set in a face that had stopped being soft sometime in the past 4 months, hands more accustomed to a needle or a bread pan than the kind of work the last 6 days had required of them. The blistering and the raw patches between her fingers were new, the kind of damage that came from work her hands had not been trained for. She was not a large woman, not a strong one by any measure. Anyone watching her would have applied to that word, and she had been on the trail alone for 6 days, which was 2 longer than she had planned, because the Tongue River crossing had cost her half a day, and the front axle had been grinding since Billings, and she could not push the gray past a certain pace without hearing something in the wagon's frame that made her slow down again. She thought about the axle sometimes when she was walking alongside the wagon to give the gray a rest on the flat stretches. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, now not with the open-ended speculation she might once have allowed herself, the kind of thinking that wandered out to its edges and came back with possibilities, but with a specific and practical attention to what could be done about it and what couldn't. The axle was cracked, not broken. It was producing noise that suggested it would worsen before it improved. She could not fix it on the trail with what she had. She could avoid stressing it by keeping the pace steady and the loads balanced and not taking the wagon over ground that would torque the frame. She had been doing all of these things. The axle had held for 4 days. She could not know whether it would hold for 4 more. This was the quality of her thinking now. Not hopeful, not despairing, just accurate. 4 months of practice at accuracy had produced this. Court had died in July, not slowly the way she had expected death to work the slow recession of a man giving ground to something stronger, the kind of dying that allowed for preparation and farewell. He had been working in the afternoon and had not come in for supper, and she had found him in the field near the north fence already gone. The fever having progressed in the hours since midday so fast that there had been no interval between sick and dead that she could identify in retrospect. She had spent 3 days trying to find that interval, lying awake at night, running back through the last week for the signs she had missed the slight sluggishness he had shown on Tuesday that she had attributed to heat, the way he had eaten less than usual at supper on Wednesday. She had found signs. She did not know if finding them changed anything. She had eventually stopped trying to find more of them and had turned her attention to what came next because what came next was considerable. What came next was Orson Hatch. Not immediately, there were several weeks of correspondence, first letters arriving with the regularity of a tide, each one more specific than the last about the numbers and what the numbers required. Hatch ran his operation out of Billings with 2 employees and a reputation for precision that the territory's smaller ranchers and settlers had learned to either respect or fear, depending on which side of his ledger they occupied. He was not a cruel man. Idella had turned this over many times since the way you turn a stone to see what lives under it, and cruelty was never the right word for what he was. He was a man of considerable tidiness. He believed in the accurate representation of what was owed and what was owned, and he believed that the world worked better when these two things were brought into alignment with each other as directly as possible. He arrived in October in a buggy that was cleaner than any vehicle had a right to be on roads like that, wearing a suit that had been brushed that morning, and he sat down at the table in the house that was not yet quite not hers, and laid out the papers one by one, smoothing each one flat before placing the next beside it. He read the numbers aloud. He explained what they meant. He did not rush her, and he did not soften anything which she found in retrospect to be a form of respect she had not anticipated from him. The respect of a man who assumes the person across the table is capable of understanding what they are hearing without assistance. She asked him 3 questions. He answered all 3 directly. When she signed the papers, he blotted them carefully with the blotter he had brought with him in his coat pocket and put them away in a leather folder he then placed precisely at the edge of the table. He was not finished. He walked through the house with her, which was the part she had dreaded, and which turned out to be the least bearable. Not because of anything he did, but because of what the walking through required of her. The act of seeing each room as an inventory, rather than a place, the bedroom, where the iron bed frame would become a line item, and the good quilts would become another line item, and the cedar chest, whose smell she associated with her mother, would become a third. The kitchen where the table court had built their first winter, the one with the uneven leg he had always meant to fix, would be assessed and assigned a value she could not have named herself because she had never thought of it in terms of value. The table had been a table. Now it was something else. The process of turning it into something else took most of the afternoon. At the end, when she stood in the yard with the toolbox and the blankets and the satchel and the Dutch oven and the roll of canvas and the rope, everything that constituted the remainder of her life assembled in a pile on the frozen ground. Hatch stood beside his buggy and looked at her with the same calm eyes he had used for the ledgers. A woman alone on the Bowman Trail in November, he said, his voice carrying nothing sharper than the flat assessment of arithmetic. That's not brave. That's just slow. She did not answer. There was nothing to answer. She picked up the toolbox and began loading the wagon. She would think about that sentence many times in the days that followed. Not with anger, though anger would have been available to her if she had reached for it. More with the detached attention she had been giving to everything since July. The attention that wanted to know whether a thing was accurate, and if it was accurate, what to do with the accuracy. He had not been wrong about slow. She had always been a slow person in the specific way that he meant it. Not stupid, not timid, but thorough, inclined to look at a thing from all its sides before committing to an approach, inclined to pack an extra seam rather than risk the first one failing. Court had called it stubbornness. Her father had called it Norwegian. She had never called it anything because it was simply how she was built, the same way her hands were built for fine work rather than heavy work, the same way her mind moved in straight lines rather than arcs. Slow on the Bowman Trail in November might kill her. She knew this. She was accounting for it. The gray mule had no name beyond the gray which Cor had called him from the first day they had him, and which had stuck the way accurate nicknames always stuck. He was 15 years old with a white patch above his right eye and a disposition best described as severe. He did not spook at things that should have spooked him, and he did not respond to things that should have moved him, and he had his own idea of the appropriate pace for any given terrain that bore no relationship to what Idella thought the appropriate pace was and was never revised in response to her opinion. The one time she had tried the whip the second day, cold and behind schedule and frightened, in a way she was not yet skilled at managing. He had stopped walking entirely and turned and given her a long level look over his shoulder that conveyed with more clarity than most people manage with language that this was not a productive direction for their relationship. She had not tried it again. What he did was work. Every hour of every day at the pace he had calculated was correct for the conditions without complaint and without the need for encouragement. His big gray head swinging slightly with each step in the way of a creature that has found its rhythm and sees no reason to leave it. On the long, flat stretches, when she climbed down from the wagon seat and walked alongside him to save the axle, she found herself matching his rhythm without deciding to, her footfalls falling into the same steady interval as his. And there was something in this, something in the shared, unambitious forward motion of it that she found easier to sustain than anything she had felt in the 4 months since July. On the morning of the sixth day, she woke before light in the camp she had made on the lee side of a low sandstone outcropping in the narrow space between rock and wagon, where the wind was slightly less than everywhere else. The ground she had slept on was frozen hard enough that she felt it in her hip and shoulder all night, the cold transmitting through the canvas and the blanket into her bones with a patience that matched the trail's own patience. She had slept anyway. Exhaustion had become a more reliable anesthetic than comfort. She built the morning fire carefully with the wood she had been collecting along the root pieces of dead willow and cottonwood from the creek drainages carried on the wagon rather than burned immediately, because wood was scarcer on the high open sections, and she had learned by the second day to take it when she found it. The fire was small, small enough to be useful and not large enough to be seen at any distance, because the habits she had formed in the first days of the trip had been formed with the cold in mind, but also with other things in mind, the other things that move through empty country and that a woman alone needed to be thoughtful about. She had seen no one in 3 days. She expected to see no one. She kept the fire small anyway. She heated the water because the gray needed it warm, or he would not drink enough, and a mule that did not drink enough on the trail in cold weather was a problem that compounded itself in ways she could not afford. She set the flat pan down in the frozen dirt and stepped back and watched him lower his big head and drink each breath rising in white columns in the cold air, separate and deliberate. She had been watching him do this every morning for 6 days and had not grown tired of it. There was something in the unhurried quality of his drinking, the way he took exactly what he needed, and no more the way the steam rose from each breath in the same shape each time that she found she needed to see each morning before she could properly begin the day. Her father had taught her this. Animal first always, because the animal cannot tell you when it needs something, and a person can. She drank after from the canteen she had kept inside her coat against her body overnight, the water tasting of leather and the faint mineral quality of the creek she had filled it from 2 days back. She ate a piece of dried elk standing up, chewing it thoroughly, her eyes on the horizon to the northwest, where the sky was a pale, inoffensive gray with no opinion about the day. She thought about her father most mornings on the trail. Not in a way that was deliberate. She did not sit down to think about Arvid. Crane did not set aside a portion of the morning for the purpose. He simply arrived the way he had been arriving for 4 months, in the specific and practical way of someone who has something useful to say and says it and then leaves. She would be doing something with her hands, tightening a lashing, checking the water barrel, gauging the angle of the trail ahead, and his voice would appear in the action attached to it, the way a memory sometimes attaches itself to a smell or a sound. Not his face, usually, just his voice and the specific thing the voice was saying, which was always something she could use. She had not seen him in 9 years. He had not made the crossing to America, had considered it, had discussed it with her mother in the way they discuss large things, which was without urgency and without resolution, the conversation existing as a permanent feature of their household, rather than something that moved toward a conclusion. He had died in the winter of 1882. 2 years after she and Court crossed over a fact she had received in a letter that arrived 4 months after the fact. The delay making the grief strange and dislocated, arriving as it did into a life that had already reorganized itself around his absence without knowing that his absence had become permanent. She had carried the letter to the barn that afternoon and sat with the gray in the cold for an hour. Not crying, just sitting, and the gray had stood with his ears forward and his head slightly lowered in the way he sometimes did when she was in the barn without a clear purpose. As though he understood that her being there meant something was wrong, and that his job in those circumstances was simply to be present. She had thought of that afternoon every time she looked at him since. It was one of the things she had not told Court and had not told anyone, not because it was a secret, but because it was one of those private facts about herself that did not require a recipient. The sky was still pale and inoffensive when she broke camp and checked the lashing on the water barrel and climbed to the wagon seat. The gray stood with ears forward along the direction of the trail, waiting with the patience of something that has never been in a hurry and has never been given cause to regret it. She clicked her tongue. He moved. For the first 2 hours, the day was simply cold. The trail was frozen hard, which made footing easier but riding rougher, each rut and frozen crack in the ground, transmitting directly through the wagon frame and into her spine, with a regularity she had learned to absorb rather than brace against. Because bracing was a posture that cost energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. The northwest wind had been constant since the tongue crossing 3 days back. Not violent, just present. The way a headache is present, a continuous fact of the environment she had stopped fighting and started accounting for. She had 160 kilometers remaining by her estimate. 5 more days at the gray's pace, maybe 6 if the axle worsened. She was running these numbers foot against distance, against the remaining margin of each when the gray stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped completely in the middle of the trail in a way he had not done in 6 days of walking, standing with his ears rotated forward and slightly up towards something that was not quite the direction of the trail. She looked where his ears were pointing. Northwest. The sky was wrong. Not darker, flatter, as though the light behind it had been pressed back behind something that did not transmit the way sky normally did. The color was the color of old iron, absorbing rather than reflecting. The wind that had blown constant and cold from the northwest all morning had stopped, not lessened. Stopped as though a hand had been placed over the source of it. Her father had explained this phenomenon to her when she was 12, standing on the headland at Norland with a storm coming off the Norwegian Sea. The sea had gone flat first, then the wind had done the same, and she had asked him what it meant, and he had told her. When the wind stops, he said, it is being pulled somewhere else. Pressure building in a column you cannot see somewhere beyond the horizon. When it releases without negotiation. And it releases with everything it has been storing. She had been 12. She had not understood why he was telling her this. She understood now. She stood on the wagon seat and looked northwest. The sky in that direction was no longer just flat and wrong-colored. It was a wall. A mass of cloud, dark at the top and nearly black at the base, running the full width of the horizon, moving south at a pace that was visible, that she could watch the way you watch water rise when there is nothing to stop it. At its base, where it met the ground, there was a pale gray smear that she recognized before she consciously identified it, the body understanding before the mind caught up. It was snow. Not falling snow, driven snow, horizontal, moving at the speed of the wind behind it. She had seen it once before as a child on the Norland headland, and her father had not described it to her that day. He had simply pulled her inside and barred the door and stood at the window and watched it come. And she had stood beside him and watched it come, and neither of them had said anything because there was nothing to say about a thing like that. You watched it or you didn't. It came regardless. 2 hours, perhaps less. She could not know precisely. She was on an exposed ridge running north to south, open on both sides. No trees of any consequence. Within half a kilometer, no structures visible in any direction. No settlement within a full day's ride. The gray was already trembling. Not with cold, he was beyond the threshold where cold alone produced trembling, but with the particular full-body shiver of an animal reading the air and understanding what it was reading. She looked east. A shallow drainage slope fell away in that direction, offering nothing, no cover, no shelter, no feature of the ground that would interrupt what was coming. She looked west, past the wagon, past the trail itself. Sandstone outcroppings, low ones 3-4 meters at most, the kind she had passed dozens of times in 6 days without stopping to examine. The same formations appeared throughout this country, worn smooth and stratified, in bands of cream and rust and orange, shaped by centuries of the same wind that was now building its wall to the northwest. They were simply part of the landscape, unremarkable as the grass, as the frozen dirt, as the pale winter sky on a day with no weather in it. She had not looked at them. She had no reason to look at them. She looked at them now, with a specific and practical attention that was looking for something particular. She was not looking for shelter. She was looking for walls. The difference was everything. A shelter was something you found or waited for a barn, a dugout, a line shack built by some rancher for exactly this contingency, the kind of structure that existed at the end of a known distance and rewarded you for covering that distance. A wall was something different. A wall was already built. It was already standing. It had been standing since before anyone had thought to use it, and it would continue standing after everyone who had ever thought about it was gone. The question was whether the walls she could see from where she stood were the right walls, the right configuration, the right orientation, the right depth, and the only way to answer that question was to walk to them and look. She climbed down from the wagon. She tied the gray's reins to the wagon's front stake with a loop she could pull free quickly, leaving him enough lead to move, but not enough to go anywhere. Then she began walking west. The first outcropping was 30 meters from the trail. It rose about 3 meters above the ground, stratified in the layered horizontal bands, common to this formation type, wind-carved on its western face and smoother on the eastern side, where the wind had done less work over the centuries. Two shallow pockets were cut into its eastern face by the differential erosion of softer and harder rock layers. She walked to the first pocket and pressed her back flat against it, feeling the curve of the sandstone against her shoulder blades. Barely a meter deep at its maximum. Her heels were still fully outside. She moved to the second pocket. Deeper, nearly a meter and a half, but narrow tight enough that she would have had to turn sideways to stand inside it. Its opening faced northeast, which was almost exactly the direction the wind would be coming from. She would have been standing in a funnel. She turned and walked. The second formation was 60 meters further west, lower than the first, and more broken part of it had collapsed at some point in the past, leaving a rubble of orange and tan slabs piled at its base. She walked the length of it, looking at each section of the face. The pockets here were shallow and irregular, formed by the collapsed sections rather than by clean erosion, their floors uneven and their roofs unreliable. She kept walking. The third formation was 360 meters from the wagon. She had nearly passed it. The approach from the east showed only the flat face of the rock, stratified, worn, unremarkable. From this angle, nothing to distinguish it from dozens of formations she had walked past in 6 days. She went around the southern end and looked at the eastern face from closer. The pocket here was different. It was wide 5 meters across, considerably wider than anything she had seen curving inward at the top, and on both sides in a way that suggested not simple erosion, but something more structural, as though the rock had been laid down in a configuration that had always tended toward this shape. The alcove it created was not a cave. It did not go back far enough, and the ceiling was not stone above her except for the natural ledge of the overhang, but it was something more substantial than a simple indentation. At its deepest point, it went 2 full meters into the rock. The floor inside was dry. The ledge of harder rock that formed its roof had protected the interior from rain and from the accumulating snow of previous winters. The floor swept almost clean by the currents of air that moved differently inside the formation than outside it. The walls rose on 3 sides, left, right, and back in the solid, uninterrupted faces of the original rock. Not crumbled, not compromised, ancient, in the way that sandstone is ancient, which is a very long time. The opening faced east, directly away from the northwest wind that was building its wall on the horizon. She stood in the opening and made herself look at it carefully rather than with relief, because relief was a feeling that could make you see what you wanted to see rather than what was there, and she needed to see what was there. The width of the opening was approximately 5 meters. The depth at center was 2 meters. The height at the opening was perhaps 2.5 meters, narrowing to 2 meters at the back, where the floor met the rear wall. The floor was dry sandstone and loose soil, level enough. The overhang above the opening would shed snow and redirect wind upward and outward, which was the correct direction for both. 3 walls, solid and movable, built by forces that no storm she would ever encounter in her lifetime could approach. Her father's voice arrived the way it had been arriving for 4 months, attached to what her hands and eyes were doing, rather than to any deliberate act of memory. The wind doesn't kill you. It just takes everything your body worked to keep. She had been 9 years old the first time she heard it. They were on the headland at Norland in spring, the air still cold enough to require a coat the sea below them, the particular gray-green of Norwegian spring water. The fishing shacks were below them, built into the cliff faces, low structures of driftwood and sealskin, and whatever material had been available, no chimneys, no stoves, nothing to make heat. She had asked her father how the men survived in those shacks in winter. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. He sometimes did this not from dismissiveness, but from the habit of a man who did not speak until he knew what he was going to say. Then he pointed to the shacks and asked what she noticed about them. She said they were small. He said yes. She said they were tucked into the rock. He said yes. He asked what was not there. She looked again more carefully and inventoried them the way he had taught her to inventory things, starting from the outside and working in not assuming she knew what she was looking at before she had actually looked. No chimney, no stovepipe, no lamp visible through any opening, no source of heat at all beyond the bodies of the men inside them. He said that's the point. He explained it directly, patiently, in the specific and unhurried way he explained everything, as though he had all the time available that the subject required. A human body at rest, he told her, in still air at -18, Celsius loses heat slowly. Loses it, but slowly. The body produces heat continuously, even at rest. He named the unit the British thermal unit, a thing her 9-year-old mind received without knowing what to do with, and filed away anyway, and would not retrieve for 22 years. Roughly 300 of them every hour, even at rest, even sleeping. In still air, this heat creates a thin layer against the skin, a barrier like a garment made of warmth rather than cloth. The body rebuilds it as fast as it loses it. It can maintain this for hours with the right outer clothing, even in severe cold. Wind destroys the barrier. Wind moving at 30 kilometers per hour strips it faster than the body can rebuild it, not gradually, not incrementally, but fast, the way a hand sweeps crumbs from a table. At 60 kilometers per hour, which was common in a plains blizzard, the rate of loss became nearly unsurvivable. Cold did not kill people. Cold killed people when wind gave it away to work. Remove the wind and cold was a manageable arithmetic. Let the wind in, and the arithmetic turned against you faster than thought. The shacks had no heat source. They did not need one. What they had was walls, 4 of them sealed at every joint, every gap packed with rope fiber or moss or mud or whatever was available. The men inside were warm, not because anyone had provided them with fire, but because the wind could not find them. A wall did not need to be beautiful, did not need to be permanent, did not need to outlast more than the immediate storm. It only needed to be complete. She had 3 walls. She needed 4. She turned and ran back to the wagon. The wagon was not good. It had not been good when Court bought it 6 years ago from a man in Laramie who sold it with the confidence and the handshake of a man selling something he has already gotten his value from. The front axle had been repaired with a splice of iron, not quite the right gauge. This was the thing that produced the grinding she had been living with since Billings. The canvas cover had torn in a windstorm 2 days west of Billings and now hung in strips from the rear bows. The left rear wheel wobbled on a worn hub that she had repacked twice on the trail. One of the sideboards had split along its top edge in a way that reduced its structural contribution to the assembly. The tailgate hung at an angle from a single functioning hinge, the other having sheared off at some point in the past 6 days, without her noticing until the 4th morning when she had reached for the latch and found it missing. By any reasonable measure, the wagon was scrap. No trader in Wyoming territory would have offered $1 for it and expected to get the dollar's worth back. She did not see scrap, she saw a wall. Not the whole wagon. She could not move the whole wagon without the gray, and she could not use the gray for this because the gray needed to be inside the alcove when the storm hit. What she could use was the box, the platform, the sideboards, the flat wooden bed of the wagon with its 90-centimeter sideboards and its 3-meter length. She estimated it at roughly 140 kilograms. She could not carry it. She could not lift it. But the ground between the wagon and the alcove ran downhill at a slight but real angle. She had noticed it on the way back, the way the trail sat just fractionally higher than the outcroppings to the west. A difference of perhaps 2 or 3 degrees from level that was nearly imperceptible until you were looking for it. 2 or 3 degrees was enough. She had 18 meters of rope. She unhitched the gray from the shafts, pulling the pin at the collar, lifting the traces clear, moving quickly because the light was wrong now, and had been wrong since she stood on the wagon seat and looked northwest. She led the gray forward and looped his reins twice around the trunk of the juniper, growing from a crack in the nearest outcropping, a bent, stubborn, wind-tortured thing that should not have been alive in a crack in sandstone at this elevation, and clearly had not been consulted on the question of whether its situation was suitable. She looked at the gray. She said the Norwegian word her father had used with his draft horses, low and flat, the word that meant stay in the way. A stone means stay. Not a request, not a command, but a statement of what was going to continue to be true. The gray put his ears forward and stood. She went to the front of the wagon and pulled the kingpin from the front bolster. The shaft and tongue dropped to the frozen ground with a sound that was loud in the unnatural quiet of the stopped wind. She went to the rear and did the same with the rear coupling. The wagon box, free of its running gears, settled flat on the frozen earth, a heavy, open, battered wooden crate. From the toolbox, she took her father's draw knife. From the damaged sideboard, she pried a plank free with the claw of the hammer, a piece roughly 2 meters long and 5 centimeters thick, reasonably straight, which she wedged under the front edge of the wagon box to reduce the friction of the box's flat bottom on the frozen grass. Then she threaded the rope through the post pockets along the box's front edge, built a harness across her shoulders and chest, cinched it as tight as she could manage, and leaned into it. The box moved. Not easily, not fast, but it moved the wedge, doing enough work on the frozen grass to overcome the initial inertia. The slight downhill angle adding its small contribution, the box scraping across the frost with a sound like canvas tearing, leaving a dark scar in the ice behind it. She found her method in the first 20 meters, short deliberate surges rather than sustained, rocking the box forward in increments, letting it settle between surges rather than fighting its weight continuously. The rope bit into her through her coat at the collarbones. After 50 meters, her hands were raw inside her gloves. After 100, her shoulders burned with the specific burning of muscles pushed past their training. After 200, she was not thinking about her shoulders. She was thinking about the light, which had changed from pale to the yellow-green that she associated with a single memory: a headland, a child, a storm that had killed 14 men at sea, and a father's hand on her shoulder pulling her inside without a word spoken between them. The wall of cloud to the northwest was no longer on the horizon. It had consumed the sky from the zenith down. It took her 40 minutes to cover 365 meters. She positioned the wagon box across the center of the alcove's opening. Sideboards facing out the flat wooden wall rising 90 centimeters across the widest and most critical section of the gap. The box's 3-meter length did not cover the full 5-meter opening. It left gaps of roughly a meter at each end where the box's corners did not meet the sandstone walls. Above the sideboards, between the top of the box's wall and the overhang of the rock above, was another 90 centimeters of open space. She pulled the torn canvas from the wagon bows where it still hung and stretched it across the upper gap, pressing its top edge into the crevices along the overhang and weighting it with rocks. She pulled from the ground, with hands that had passed the threshold of cold, into something nearer numbness. The bottom edge she tied to the sideboard post with lengths cut from the remaining rope. The canvas did not cover everything. It billowed at one corner. It opened where the old tear had weakened it. She turned to the slope below the outcropping where the grass grew thick and dead brown and knee-high, dried since September, but still rooted, still present, still useful. She gathered it armful by armful, packing it into the gaps at each end where the wagon box did not meet the sandstone walls, handful after handful into the crevices between wood and rock, pressing until no daylight came through. Pressing until the pressure of the grass against her palms was the only sensation her hands were still capable of registering. Where the canvas opened at the top, she hung the first wool blanket, weighting its upper edge with stones pressed into the overhang crevices. At the base of the wagon box, where the ground was uneven and gaps showed between wood and frozen earth, She scraped soil from the alcove floor, loose and sandy and dry, and packed it against the wood like mortar against stone, pressing it with both palms, tamping more on top, working along the entire base, until the line between box and ground was continuous. She had been 15 when her father came back from the collapsed fishing shack. Two men dead inside a structure he had described afterward as better built than most good timber. Good joinery, a sound roof. But someone at some earlier time had cut a small hole in the windward wall for a stovepipe. The stove long since removed the opening, covered with a piece of tin that had worked loose in a previous storm and been poorly resecured, and in this storm had lifted. The wind had entered through an opening the diameter of a fist. The temperature inside had dropped to outside within minutes. Both men had been asleep when it happened and had not woken up. Her father had stood in the doorway of their house for a long time after returning from the site, saying nothing, his coat still on as though he had forgotten he was wearing it. He was not a man who required silence to think, but he used it when the thinking was about something he did not want to get wrong. Then he said it not to her mother, not to her, to the middle distance of the room. It was a good wall. But good isn't complete. She had no gaps. She's checked them all a final time, running her hands along the base of the box, across the grass-packed side gaps, along the upper edge of the canvas. Everywhere she felt solid resistance. The wall was not good, not beautiful, not built from anything designed for this purpose or capable of lasting past the morning. But it was complete. It was the only thing that mattered, and it was complete. She had given the wind nowhere to enter. The gray came last. This was arithmetic, not sentiment, though she felt the sentiment too, and did not think less of herself for feeling it. A mule at rest produces roughly 400 British thermal units per hour. In a space the size of this alcove, 8 or 9 cubic meters of usable air, by her estimate that heat would raise the interior temperature several degrees over the course of a night. The difference between cold that merely numbed the extremities and cold that stopped the heart was not always a large difference. Sometimes it was the size of a mule. She left a gap at the end of the wagon box and let him through. He had to duck his head under the overhang and angle his hindquarters through the narrow space between the box end and the rock wall, and he planted his feet at the entrance and looked at it, and looked at her with the measured skepticism he applied to most of her proposals. She did not pull or push. She put both hands flat against the coarse hair of his cheeks, her palms feeling the warmth of his skin through his winter coat. And she stood with him the way she had learned to stand with animals that were afraid or resistant, not trying to move them, not explaining anything, simply present, and still letting the contact itself be the only communication. The gray breathed. She breathed. After a moment, he lowered his nose and walked in. She sealed the gap behind him with the second blanket and more grass packing it until her hands could no longer report on what they were doing with any reliability. She sat against the back wall of the alcove with the leather satchel in her lap. The space was dark. It smelled of rock and dry grass and animal warmth, and something older under all of that, the smell of sandstone that had not seen open air in a long time. A mineral smell, ancient and indifferent in the way that very old things are indifferent. The indifference of something that has simply been here through everything that has happened and expects to continue being here through everything that will. She could not see the sky through any part of her wall. She had built what she could build, sealed what she could seal. Whether complete was enough, the storm would tell her. The sound came first before the wind itself returned. A low vibration from the northwest, like distant thunder, that did not stop building in 30 seconds into a roar. She felt through the rock at her back and the ground beneath her, a physical pressure, a weight of sound, the noise of something enormous moving fast across flat ground with nothing in its way. The first gust hit the face of the cliff above the alcove and split around it, and the wall she had built shuddered, and the canvas pulled against its lashings, and the grass in the side gaps whistled with a thin, frantic sound of something compressed beyond its nature. Snow appeared inside the alcove, not falling but driving horizontal fine, as flour dust sieving through the imperfections in the wall she had not been able to see in the failing light. It stung where it touched her face. The wagon box did not move. The rock walls on 3 sides did not flex. The overhang above did not shift. The storm found the face of the cliff and broke against it and roared past on both sides and above, And inside the alcove, the air, though cold, was still. The stillness was everything. It was the difference between arithmetic that worked and arithmetic that didn't. It was what her father had been teaching her on the headland and in the barn and in the workshop and in every conversation where he had told her something direct and specific and practical about the way forces behaved when they met resistance. It was the point. The first hour was the worst for sound. The roar did not hold steady. That would have been easier, something to calibrate against and eventually stop hearing the way you stop hearing a river when you camp beside it long enough. Instead, it moved in patterns she could not predict, swelling to a pitch that pressed against her eardrums, then dropping briefly into something almost like quiet before surging again. Each surge slightly different from the last, as though the storm were a thing that was testing. Methodical in its own enormous way, applying pressure at one point, and then another, looking for the place where the resistance gave. She had heard wind before. She had grown up on a coast where winter storms came off the Norwegian Sea with the full weight of the North Atlantic behind them, where the men who built boats designed them with that weight in mind, building in flex and give so the hull would not shatter under impact, but would move with the force rather than against it. What she heard now was not like that wind. That wind had been wet and salt-laden, full of the smell of open water and kelp, and the distant cold of deep ocean. This was dry and fast, and carried nothing but itself, and what it carried was the kind of cold that did not accumulate gradually but arrive fully formed. The way a door opening into a cold room makes the cold of that room instantly present to everything in the one next to it. Through the wall she felt it more than heard it. The vibration came through the sandstone at her back in slow, deep pulses, the rock conducting what the air was doing on the other side of the cliff face, transmitting force without being moved by it. She had her back flat against the rear wall of the alcove, her coat pulled across her front, the leather satchel in her lap, and she could feel each pulse of the storm through the stone, the way you feel a large vehicle passing on the other side of a wall. Not the sound, but the pressure, the evidence of something massive in motion nearby. The wagon box in front of her trembled in the first hour, with a fine, continuous shiver she could see in the weak remaining light that came through the canvas where it had not perfectly sealed against the overhang. The canvas itself moved with each gust, distending outward in a smooth curve, and then snapping back when the gust peaked and the pressure briefly equalized on both sides. She watched it. Every time it moved, she watched to see whether it would tear further, whether a lashing would pull free, whether the gap she had not been fully satisfied with at the upper right corner would widen into something she would have to address. In the first hour, it tore twice. The first time was at the left lashing, where she had tied the rope around a post that had cracked along its grain at some point in the preceding months and had less purchase in the wood than she had estimated when she was tying the knot. The canvas pulled free, and the left quarter billowed inward, and for the 3 seconds before she moved, there was a blade of wind inside the alcove that struck her full in the face with a cold so direct it was closer to a cut than a chill. Not the ambient cold of the space, which was considerable, but the moving cold, the wind-armed cold. The cold her father had told her about when she was 9 years old, standing on a headland in the spring with the fishing shacks below and the sea beyond. She moved to the lashing in the near dark, her fingers inside her gloves having crossed from cold into the territory, past cold where the hands still perform the actions they are directed to perform, but without being able to report reliably on whether they are performing them correctly. She retied the lashing around the post and then looped it back around the rope connecting to the adjacent post, doubling the anchor point. She pulled the knots tight by feel, gauging their security by the resistance she felt when she pulled rather than by anything she could see or measure. The second tier was at the top where the canvas had been weakened months ago by a broken bow tip that had pushed through the material and left a puncture that the surrounding fibers had been compensating for ever since. The wind found this weakness in the way wind always found weaknesses, not with the directness of something that knew where to look, but with the thoroughness of something that checked everywhere simultaneously and simply arrived at the place of least resistance faster than you would expect. The tear opened to the length of her forearm in under a minute. She had anticipated this possibility while packing the grass into the side gaps, had registered the weakened area, and had not allowed herself to think further about it. Because thinking further about things she could not address until they became actual problems was a habit she had been working to shed since July, when thinking further had consumed 3 days of lying awake running backward through the week before court died, looking for the signs she should have caught finding them, and being unable to do anything useful with the finding. She moved to the tear and pressed the second blanket into service as a patch, weighing its upper edge with the two flattest stones she had kept inside for exactly this contingency, its lower edge pressed against the canvas and held there by the tension of the wind pushing from outside, which was she noted the wind being useful for the first time since the storm began. The blanket reduced the gap. It did not eliminate it. A thin stream of cold air continued to move through the overlap between the blanket's edge and the canvas when the gusts peaked, raising the hair on the back of her neck, but thin and narrow, and she calculated it against the total volume of the space and determined it was not enough to matter significantly against the body heat she and the gray were producing between them. The gray stood behind her throughout. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the rock walls as a fixed feature of the situation, something that had been positioned and remained positioned. He did not kick, did not attempt to turn in the narrow space, did not make the sounds of a frightened animal, which was what she had been most concerned about when she was leading him through the gap, because a frightened mule in an enclosed space would have been a problem with no good solution. What he did was stand. He stood with the quality of stillness that was particular to him, the stillness of an animal that has arrived at its own assessment of a situation and found the assessment satisfactory. She could not know what his assessment was. She was grateful for it regardless. In the second hour, the character of the cold inside the alcove changed. It had been decreasing since the storm hit, the temperature dropping as the stored warmth of the day's sun and the ambient ground heat that had built up in the sandstone walls was drawn out of the rock and into the air. But in the second hour, the rate of decrease slowed. She felt this in her face, which was the most exposed part of her and the part most capable of registering small differences in temperature. The cold was still considerable. She estimated -10 inside the alcove, possibly colder, but it was no longer dropping at the pace it had been dropping in the first hour. The gray's body heat was accumulating in the space. 400 BTUs per hour into 8 cubic meters of air produced a gradient. She could feel the air near the gray was measurably warmer than the air near the walls, and the air near the walls was warmer than the air had been an hour ago. The arithmetic was working, slowly with the patience of a calculation rather than the urgency of a rescue, but it was working. She ate a piece of dried elk from the satchel, pulling it from the leather pouch by feel in the near dark, and a square of hardtack that she held in her palm for a moment before eating because it was completely rigid with cold and needed a moment to soften even fractionally. She chewed slowly and thoroughly with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that what they are consuming is not a meal, but a fuel calculation, calories against cold, the body's production rate against the rate at which the environment was spending it. She drank from the canteen she had kept inside her coat against her chest overnight, the water barely above freezing, tasting of leather, and the mineral trace of the creek she had filled it from 3 days back. She drank the full amount she intended to drink even though she did not feel thirsty, because she had learned in the first days of the trip that the cold suppressed the sensation of thirst while simultaneously requiring more hydration to support the body's heating effort, and that the suppression of the feeling was not the same as the suppression of the need. Sometime in what she estimated was the third hour, she pressed her face against the side of the gray's neck. She had not planned to do this. She had moved closer to him gradually during the second hour, drawn by the warmth his body was putting into the space, and the movement had been practical until the moment when it became something other than practical, which was the moment when her cheek made contact with the coarse hair of his winter coat, and she felt the warmth of the living animal directly against her skin rather than through the air. His coat smelled of dry grass and animal warmth, and the specific smell of a body doing its work without anxiety. A living smell, the smell of simple functioning, which was the opposite of the smell of the alcove's ancient stone, and which was, she found the thing she had needed without knowing she needed it. Under the smell of his coat, under the dry grass, and the sweat of the day's work, there was something older and more particular. the smell of a horse barn in winter, the smell of straw and warmth, and the specific biological heat of large animals enclosed in a small space. She had not smelled that exact combination since she was very small. Since the barn at Norland that her father kept behind the workshop, the place she had gone in winter when the house was too full of her brothers, and she wanted to be somewhere that was simply warm and quiet and uncomplicated. She had not known she still had that specific memory, or that it was housed in that specific smell, or that finding it here would feel the way it felt, not comforting, exactly because comfort was too large a word for something that lasted 2 breaths and then was over. More like the sudden identification of something you have been carrying without knowing what it was. She sat back against the wall. The storm continued. The gray breathed. In the fourth hour, she found herself thinking about Court in a way she had not allowed herself to think about him since July. The not allowing had not been a decision she had made consciously. It had been a matter of necessity. In the weeks after July, she had discovered that thinking about him in any sustained way produced a state she could not afford in the context of everything that needed doing. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more consuming than grief. Something that took up the space where decision-making lived and left decisions unmade and actions untaken and time passing without purpose. And time passing without purpose was a thing she could not afford, because time passing without purpose was how you arrived at the end of October still in a house that was not yours, with nothing done about the fact that it was not yours, waiting for Orson Hatch to arrive with his ledger. She had been keeping Court at a specific distance, the distance at which he could be present without being disruptive, the distance that allowed her to think about the table leg he had always meant to fix with something like ordinary sadness rather than the other thing. But here in the dark, with the storm doing its work outside, and the calculation inside going the way she had needed it to go, and nothing left to do but sit with the gray and wait for the arithmetic to finish. There was no work to put in the distance, and the distance collapsed. He had been a man who noticed things, not in the careful, systematic way her father noticed things. Her father's noticing was a professional skill applied deliberately to everything, but in a more oblique way, the way of someone who came at the world from an angle. He had noticed the first winter they spent in Wyoming that the cattle moved differently before a storm than during one, not nervously, not hurriedly, but with a particular directness, heading for the lowest ground available as though they had been told to. He had watched them do this for 2 seasons before he mentioned it to her, and when he mentioned it, he said it not as a discovery, but as a confirmed observation, something he had been testing long enough to be confident of. He had been that way about most things, patient in the noting, quiet about it until he was sure. She had not known when she left Billings whether she would cry for him before she arrived in Buffalo. She had not cried since July, not from absence of grief, but from the same reason she had kept him at distance. The timing was wrong, the circumstances required something other than grief. And she was a person who, when the circumstances required something specific, generally managed to produce it. She had thought vaguely that she might cry when she was safe, when safe was available. She did not cry in the alcove. She sat with him for a while in the cold and the dark, while the storm worked outside, and the gray breathed beside her, and she thought about the table leg and the cattle, and the way he had of noticing things from an angle, and then she set it aside again carefully, in the same place she had been keeping it, and she attended to the present. The present was this: the sound outside had changed. She noticed it first as an absence. The highest register of the roar of the pitch that had been pressing against her eardrums for the past several hours was no longer present. What remained was the same sound but deeper, as though someone had removed the upper frequencies and left only the lower ones. She spent a long time deciding whether to trust this observation. It was exactly the kind of observation she would want to be making: the storm declining, the worst passing, the arithmetic near its conclusion, and wanting to make an observation was not the same as the observation being accurate. She waited. The lower sound continued without the upper sound returning. The vibration through the rock at her back was still present, but less varied, a steadier, lower pulse rather than the erratic pattern of earlier. She reached forward in the dark and pressed her palm against the lower edge of the wagon box. The gap between wood and ground packed with earth was solid. She pressed harder. It did not give. She moved her hand to the side gap nearest her, packed with dry grass, and pressed flat against it. The grass had stiffened into something closer to board than packing the moisture in the stems crystallized the fibers locked together. She pressed harder, still solid. She understood what had happened and sat with the understanding for a moment before acknowledging it. The storm had been finishing her wall. The snow the wind drove against the outside of the wagon box had been compacting in layers against the wood, filling every surface. Irregularity building up into a smooth face of wind-packed snow that was now several centimeters thick across the entire exterior of the box. The grass in the side gaps, already frozen from the inside out by the cold of the first hour, had been receiving additional reinforcement from the outside snow, driving into the remaining interstices between grass stems, freezing in place, adding its small structural contribution to what the freezing of the grass itself had already accomplished. The canvas above had accumulated a layer of ice on its outer surface, the ice layer adding rigidity and insulating properties the canvas had not possessed when she hung it. The wall she had built in 40 minutes of desperate, numb-handed work had been receiving a second builder for the past 4 hours, and the second builder was the storm itself. And the second builder did not get tired or cold or uncertain. She sat with this for a long time, not with triumph, which would have been the wrong response, a response that presumed the outcome before it was certain. More with something like intellectual satisfaction, the recognition of a mechanism behaving according to its nature, which was the kind of thing her father found satisfying, and which she apparently found satisfying for the same reasons. He had liked mechanisms. He liked the way structures revealed their logic over time, the way a thing under load showed you what it was made of and whether it had been designed with sufficient understanding of what it would face. He had taken her to look at things that had failed the shack, and twice a boat hole that had opened along an inadequately reinforced strake, and once a bridge approach that had given way in a flood, not to show her disaster, but to show her information. The failure was the wall talking. If you listened to what it said, you understood something you could apply. The storm was talking. She was listening. What it was saying was, here is where your wall is already strong, and here is where I have made it stronger. And here is the thing you built that was sufficient. In what she estimated was the 5th or 6th hour, the snow that had been filtering through the remaining imperfections in the wall stopped entirely. Not gradually, it simply stopped, which meant the outside accumulation had reached a thickness that covered all the small openings she had not been able to close with her hands. The thin, cold streams of moving air that had been finding their way through the overlap between blanket and canvas reduced to nothing. The temperature inside the alcove, which had been declining slowly all night, reached a level and held it. Not warm, cold enough to require everything she was doing, coat pulled tight, hands inside sleeves, body pressed as close to the gray as the space allowed, but not declining, stable. The arithmetic was complete. She slept. She had not planned to, and she was aware in the moment before sleep arrived of the calculus she was conducting. Was this the dangerous drowsiness of a body losing its thermal regulation? Or was this the ordinary exhaustion of a person who had been awake for 20 hours and had spent 4 of them working at the limit of her physical capacity? She ran through the evidence. Her core was warm. Her hands and feet were cold, but not the numb cold of tissue in danger, the alert cold of circulation maintained under pressure. The gray's heat was present and real on her left side. The wall was complete. She had done everything that could be done. Her body wanted to sleep, and her body was not wrong. She slept. She woke in a darkness so complete that she spent several seconds performing the basic tests of consciousness, blinking to confirm her eyes were open, moving her hand in front of her face to confirm there was a face to move it in front of. The darkness did not change with blinking. She perceived the motion of her hand as motion rather than seeing it. She was alive. She registered this the way she registered all factual information, now accurately without excess. She reached out and touched the wagon box. Cold. Dry. She touched the canvas above. Rigid and cold, the ice on the outside conducting its temperature through the material but holding its integrity. She listened. She was careful here. She had been careful about this in all the waking moments of the night, the 2 times she had surfaced from sleep briefly and listened before sleeping again. Careful not to mistake what she wanted to hear for what was actually there. She listened with the discipline her father had applied to listening, which was wait until you are certain and then wait a little longer. Because certainty arrived before actual certainty if you were tired or frightened or had something you needed to be true. The roar was gone. What remained was a low sound, distant directional, the sound of wind moving across the top of the cliff face, rather than against it, the sound of something that had passed, rather than something that was present. She listened to it for a full minute. It did not build. It held its low pitch and then over the next minutes diminished further. The storm had not stopped so much as it had run out of ways in the wall complete. The gap sealed, the arithmetic finished in her favor. The storm reduced to what it was when it had nowhere to go. A line of gray appeared at the upper edge of the canvas. Not sunlight, the pale, even gray of an overcast winter dawn, seeping through the ice layer that had built up on the canvas overnight, diffuse and without direction, but sufficient. Sufficient to see her hands. Sufficient to see the gray, standing in the same position he had occupied since she brought him inside. His breath rising in small clouds that she could now distinguish against the general dark of the alcove. Sufficient to see the interior walls, the packed grass, the frozen base, the wagon box coated on its outer face with a layer of ice and packed snow that had given it a smooth, almost architectural surface, as though it had been cast rather than assembled. She did not stand immediately. She had learned in the past 4 months not to rush the moment immediately after a thing had resolved, that rushing it was a way of not actually inhabiting it, of moving past it before you had taken from it what it had to offer. She sat in the first gray light of the morning after, and she listened to the diminishing wind, and she was present with what had happened here in this alcove on this night. With this wall and this mule and the tools in a wooden box her father had built with his own hands, and filled with things that were useful. She took inventory the way her father had taught her to take inventory after any operation that had required significant improvisation, going through each element of what she had done, and assessing what had worked and what had been inadequate, and what had worked better than she expected, and why. The wagon box had been the correct choice. Its weight had kept it in place even under sustained pressure. The side packing of grass had performed better than expected because the freezing had improved it. The canvas had been the weakest element. It had required 2 repairs in the first hour, and had never achieved the seal she had wanted, but the ice layer it accumulated overnight had compensated for its initial inadequacy. The earth packing at the base had held without requiring attention after the initial tamping. The gray had contributed both heat and steadiness, which was what she had calculated and what had been delivered. The thing she would do differently: pack the upper canvas attachment points more securely before the storm hit, rather than relying on the initial lashings. Bring more grass inside as reserves for repair work, rather than using the second blanket, which was now a damaged resource. Inspect the post grain before trusting it as an anchor point. She filed these not as failures but as information, the kind her father would have wanted. She worked the side gap open with the draw knife from the toolbox, chipping at frozen grass and ice until a section gave way. Cold air poured in, brutal, immediate, the full temperature of the exterior world entering without the mediation the wall had provided. She widened the gap. The gray put his ears forward and stepped through it without being led, as though he had been waiting for precisely this, the opening of the door that had kept them both inside. Outside was white, not the white of modest accumulation or a light covering of recent snow, the white of a world that had been remade at a fundamental level overnight. A single continuous surface extending from the base of the cliff outward in every direction to a horizon that was barely distinguishable from the overcast sky above it. Every feature of the landscape she had been reading for 6 days was gone. The trail was gone. The drainage slope to the east was gone. The scrub brush and the ruts and the low outcroppings she had used as landmarks were all under a uniform surface of wind-packed snow that was flat and featureless, except for the occasional shadow where the angled light of the low sun caught a drift at its edge. The temperature was brutal, -15, she estimated, possibly colder at the surface. But the air was perfectly still, not diminished. Still. The cold was present without being deployed the way a tool is present on a shelf, real, capable, not currently in use. She turned and looked at what she had built. The wagon box was buried to its upper edge in drifted snow, only the top few centimeters of the sideboards visible above the smooth white surface. The canvas above it was sheathed in ice and snow, its surface continuous with the face of the rock to which it had been attached, no visible boundary between manufactured material and geological formation. The side gaps she had filled with grass were invisible under the accumulated snow, smoothed into the natural contour of the outcropping, as though the packing had always been there, as though this was simply how this section of rock met the ground. From 10 meters away, from 5 meters away, it looked like a natural formation. It looked like nothing that anyone had done. The survey party that would find it in the spring would record it as a structure of unknown origin and unknown purpose. And they would not be wrong about the unknown origin, because the name of the person who built it was not attached to it in any way that the survey party would have access to, and they would not be wrong about the unknown purpose, because the purpose had been served and was complete, and left no visible evidence of itself beyond the structure that had served it. She stood in the snow to her knees and looked at the wall she had built, and she looked at it with the specific attention of someone performing an inventory rather than having a feeling, because this was how she had learned to manage the things that were too large to have as feelings in the moment she was standing in. She noted what it held. She noted what the storm had added. She noted the completeness of the seal visible even now in the way the snow had accumulated smoothly. Without the disturbance that gaps in the surface would have created the snow lying flat and uniform across the entire face of the wall, because there had been nothing for the wind to push through, nothing to disrupt the even deposition of the storm's load. The gray stood beside her, breathing columns of steam into the motionless air, one ear forward and one slightly sideways, watching her with his habitual quality of non-committal alert attention. She put her hand on the upper edge of the wagon box, the wood frozen solid under her glove. She kept it there for a moment. No one had seen her do this. No one had seen any of it. Not the calculation on the ridge when the gray stopped. Not the 2 hours of walking the outcroppings. Not the 40 minutes of pulling the wagon box across frozen ground with a rope harness that cut through her coat. Not the hours inside with the cold and the dark and the mule and the sound she would not stop hearing for weeks. No one would know the specific texture of what had happened here unless she told them, and even then, they would know only the version that language was capable of carrying, which was a different version from the one that had actually occurred, smaller and more portable, the event compressed into the shape that could fit inside words. She had not needed anyone to decide anything on her behalf. She had not needed to be cared for or rescued or advised. She had needed a father who had told her something specific and true when she was 9 years old. In a wagon box with a flat bottom and a rock formation that provided 3 walls, and the willingness to look at what was already there and see what it could do. She took her hand back. She looked south. The sun was at its low winter angle, climbing its shallow arc from somewhere in the southeast toward the southwest, and it told her everything she needed to know about where south was. She could not see the trail. She did not need the trail. She would navigate by the sun's angle and the angle of shadows on the snow, and the way her father had taught her to use the position of the sun at different hours as a compass that corrected itself continuously. Buffalo was 4 days south, maybe 5. She had food for 6. The gray needed water each day, and she would have to find it each day from wherever it was available. Fast-moving creek sections, south-facing slopes where the sun might have opened, surface ice, the bottom of drifts, where the temperature differential sometimes kept a trickle moving. She repacked what she could carry on the gray's back, the satchel across his haunches, the toolbox balanced at the shoulder point lashed with the remaining rope, each lashing checked with the same 3-point test her father had applied to everything he secured before trusting it. Pull at the knot itself, pull at the load point, pull at the anchor. If all 3 held, you moved. She checked each one. They held. The gray stood with his ears pointed south, waiting. She took up his lead rope. They began. The first day south was the hardest for direction and the easiest for everything else, which was not what she had expected. She had expected the disorientation of the featureless white to produce something close to panic, the specific panic of a person who has navigated by landmarks and found the landmarks gone, who has been reading the trail and found the trail erased. She had expected to feel the absence of the known landscape as a kind of blindness, the way you feel blind when you step from a lit room into complete dark before your eyes adjust. What she found instead was something closer to clarity. The white was uniform. The sun was precise. The shadow she cast on the snow surface moved at a rate she could measure against the time she estimated had passed, and this gave her a second reference to cross against the sun's position, and two references were sufficient. Her father had navigated at sea during overcast days with less. She drifted east twice in the morning when the terrain forced her around drifts, whose depth she could not assess from above, and whose edges she had to find by testing rather than reading. She corrected each time by waiting for the sun to clear the thin cloud layer near the horizon and taking her bearing again before moving. The corrections cost her time and cost her distance. But they were the correct corrections she had learned in the first days of the trip, that the instinct to push through uncertainty rather than stop and reorient was an instinct that produced the wrong outcome more often than not. Stop, look, know, then move. Slow was the method. Slow was what worked. The snow was wind-packed in most places, firm enough to support the gray's weight without significant breaking through, firm enough to support her own weight without the exhausting work of lifting her feet out of deep accumulation with every step. In the low spots between ridges, it was softer where the wind had deposited rather than scoured, and she tested the depth of these sections before committing to them, pressing one foot down to gauge the resistance before putting her weight on it. Reading the surface texture for the signs of deposition depth, she had been learning to distinguish since the morning after the storm. After the third such crossing, she had a sufficient mental model of how deposition and scour related to the topography of this specific section of country that she could route around most of the soft sections without testing them individually. She noted this as a skill she was developing in real time. The way she had been noting such things throughout the trip, not with pride, just with the accuracy that served her better than pride. They covered perhaps 15 kilometers before the light began to fail in the late afternoon, the sun dropping to the southwest with the speed it always dropped in November, the sky going from pale yellow to gray to the deep blue-gray of early winter dark in less time than she expected. She found a place to stop in the partial shelter of a low ridge, not a formation with any alcove, just a south-facing slope that gave her the windward side and reduced the exposure to whatever came in overnight. She scraped a hollow in the snow on the leaf face deep enough to sit and lined it with the canvas she had carried out of the alcove folded into a pad. She built a fire from the dead willow branches she had been collecting throughout the day from the creek drainages and brush lines, carrying them across the gray's back as additional load she had decided was worth the wait. Wood was scarcer on the high open sections, and she had learned by the second day of the original trip to take it when she found it, because the alternative was arriving at camp with nothing to heat water with, and a mule that would not drink enough, and a calculation that went wrong from there. The fire was small but real. She heated water for the gray first and watched him drink it from the pan. Then she boiled water for herself, not for tea. She had nothing for tea, but for the warmth of the cup in her hands and the warmth of the liquid going down. She sat with the cup for a longer moment than efficiency required. She had earned the longer moment. There was nothing that required her to be efficient about that particular minute. The second day was clearer. The overcast that had given the first day its flat, directionless light had moved east overnight, leaving a sky of the deep blue that Wyoming produced in winter when nothing was happening in it, a color that was almost aggressive in its clarity, a blue that made the white of the snow surface look yellow by comparison. The sun was precise and unambiguous, and for the first time in 6 days she could see the mountains to the west, the Bighorns. Their upper elevations white and their lower elevations dark with the timberline that ran along them at a consistent altitude. She had not known she had been missing the mountains until she saw them again. They were a reference she had not realized she was using. The way you realize you have been navigating by a landmark only when the landmark becomes visible again after an absence. The temperature had not risen above -10 by her estimate, but the stillness that had prevailed since the storm was holding, and still air at -10, was a different physical environment than moving air at -10. She could feel this in her face in the difference between the cold that simply existed in the air and the cold that the wind had been deploying against her. The cold that simply existed was manageable. It required attention and appropriate clothing and movement, but it did not compound, did not accelerate, did not use the surface of her skin as the mechanism of its own increase. She had understood this as a principle for 22 years. She had now understood it in her body, which was a different and more reliable form of understanding. She found a creek in the afternoon, the same creek she thought she had crossed on the fifth day of the original trip, running fast enough in a narrow channel to resist the freezing that had closed most of the surface water in the country. She crossed it on a snow bridge that held. She tested it with the Gray's lead rope before committing to it, pressing down at the center to assess the integrity of the snow arch, listening for the sound that ice underload makes when it is about to give, which is a specific sound and not easy to mistake once you have heard it. The bridge held. She crossed. She let the Gray drink from the open water at the edge of the channel for a long time, longer than she usually allowed, because he had been drinking less than she wanted since the storm. The cold suppressing his thirst response, the way it suppressed hers, and she had been compensating by stopping whenever she found open water and giving him time he was not requesting. While he drank, she sat on a flat rock at the bank and removed her right boot and her sock and examined the outside toes that had been sending her a muted signal since the first day after the storm. They were better than the previous day. The circulation had improved with the walking and the additional warmth. She had been managing more carefully, but two of them still showed the waxy whiteness that required attention. She rubbed them between her palms until the color returned and the skin began to register the friction as sensation rather than simply as pressure. She put the sock back on, pulled the boot on, laced it tighter than before, and did not stop moving for long enough to let the circulation she had restored dissipate. On the third day, she found the wreckage. It was in a shallow bowl between two ridges, perhaps 200 meters east of the line she was traveling, and she saw it from the high point of the ridge before beginning her descent. A wagon at a severe angle. One wheel sunk past the axle in a drift that had packed around it during the storm. The canvas cover intact, but weighted down with snow into a shape that sagged inward like a tent whose poles had failed. Around the wagon, in a radius of perhaps 50 meters, were the objects she recognized at distance as the contents of a life. A trunk with its lid thrown back, the contents either removed or obscured by snow, a cast iron pot lying on its side, the shape that might be a chair or might be a collection of wood at a particular angle, a length of rope trailing from the tailgate into the snow and disappearing somewhere beneath the surface. No animals visible, no people visible, no tracks moving away from the site in any direction, which meant that whoever had been there when the storm hit had either left before it arrived or had not left afterward. She stood on the ridge and looked at it for a moment. She looked at the wagon, and she looked at the snow around it, and she looked at the direction the wagon's tongue was pointing east, which was away from the outcroppings to the west, which meant whoever was driving had been moving east when they stopped, which meant they had been moving toward the open ground rather than toward the rock formations that might have provided the wall she had found. She did not know whether they had seen the formations and made a different calculation than she had, or whether they had not seen them at all, or whether they had been in a different section of the country where the formations were not present. She did not know, and she could not know, and the knowing would not have changed what she was looking at. She noted the position of the wreckage relative to the ridgeline and the sun's angle, fixing it in her memory with enough specificity that she would be able to direct someone to it. Then she looked south. 3 hours of usable light. The diversion to the wagon would cost her 40 minutes at minimum, and there was nothing she could provide that would improve the situation of anyone who had been there. The people who could improve the situation were people with horses and sleds and the warmth of a settlement behind them, and those people were in Buffalo, and the fastest way to get those people was to keep going south and arrive. She turned south and walked. She thought about the wagon for the rest of the afternoon and into the early dark of the camp she made that night. Not about the people who had been in it. She did not know who they were, and speculation was not useful. She thought about the wagon itself and about the difference between what she had seen in the wagon she had taken apart on the ridge and what the people in the bowl had apparently seen when they looked at their wagon. She had seen a wall. She did not know what they had seen. Perhaps they had seen shelter, the canvas cover pulled down, and weighted the wagon box turned into a kind of tent. Perhaps that had seemed like the right approach. Perhaps it had been nearly the right approach, close enough to buy them time, but not enough to see them through 19 hours of sustained assault. She did not know. She would not know. What she knew was this: the wall her father had described was not an idea you arrived at through general reasoning. It was a specific piece of knowledge, specific enough to be applied in a specific situation, specific enough to tell her to look for walls, rather than shelter specific enough to tell her that a gap in a wall was not a smaller wall, but no wall at all. You could not arrive at that specificity through general reasoning. You had to have been told. You had to have been told by someone who knew it precisely and cared enough about precision to transmit it precisely. Her father had cared about precision. He had applied it to everything he taught her: the boat hull, the dry stone wall, the fishing shacks on the cliff face, the way a compass reading required correcting for magnetic declination, the specific rate at which a human body produced British thermal units at rest. He had not been teaching her in general. He had been teaching her specific things, and the specific things had come when she needed them, with the accuracy of tools stored correctly in the place where they were needed. She was grateful for this in the way she was grateful for things she could not undo and could not reciprocate. He was 9 years dead. She was alive in a camp in the Wyoming snow because he had stood on a headland with her when she was 9 years old and told her something specific and true. She would not be able to tell him this. She would carry it instead. On the fourth day south, the land changed character in the way it changed when you drop below the high open country into the foothills. The ridges becoming lower and more gradual, the drainage patterns more complex and more vegetated, cottonwoods dark along the creek bottoms and scattered pine on the north-facing slopes. The land beginning to show evidence of habitation in the way that land shows habitation even in winter when people are largely inside. A fence line, its top wire visible above the snow running along a section line. The parallel tracks of a sled days old, softened by wind but still present. A scatter of hay across a small south-facing slope where someone had been feeding cattle, the yellow of the hay bright against the white. She was in country people lived in, country that supported the things people needed. She saw the smoke when she climbed to the top of the last significant ridge before the valley where buffalo sat, two columns of it rising absolutely straight in the still air, white against the pale sky, distinguishable only by their precision and their verticality, the unmistakable signature of fires burning in stoves inside structures that kept the wind off them. She stood on the ridge and looked at the smoke for a moment. The gray put his ears forward in that direction and held them there. She did not hurry down the slope. The smoke was there. It would continue to be there. The people who had made the fires were inside the buildings. The smoke was coming from and would continue to be there. And arriving 15 minutes later, rather than 15 minutes sooner, would not change anything except the quality of her own experience of the last quarter mile, and she had not survived 19 hours in an alcove in a blizzard in order to ruin the approach to the end of it by rushing. Callum's ranch was the second structure visible from the valley floor, a low house set back from the creek with a barn behind it and a corral fence running along the south side, the kind of place that had been built by a man who knew what he was building it for and had built it accordingly. The fence was tight and the barn roof had been cleared of snow recently, the shoveled snow visible in a pile along the north wall. She had not been here before. Callum had come to Wyoming 3 years before she left Maine, and they had not seen each other since their mother's funeral in 1881. She knew the place only from his letters, which were not long on description, and from the rough map he had drawn her in August when he was trying to give her something useful and did not know what useful would turn out to be. Callum came out of the barn before she had crossed the near field. She recognized him at once despite the 6 years because he had their father's build and their father's way of standing when he was looking at something. He was working to understand, weight slightly back, arms at his sides, not moving yet, absorbing. He had a beard now and more gray in it than she would have guessed for a man of 37, and he wore a coat she did not recognize, and boots that were different from the boots he had worn at their mother's funeral. And all of this was consistent with 6 years having passed, which they had. He stood at the barn door and looked at her across the distance of the field. He did not come toward her. He stood and looked. She kept walking. She had covered enough distance in the past 4 days that the distance between the field gate and the barn door was nothing, 200 meters flat-packed snow. No obstacles. She walked it at the same pace she had walked the past 4 days. Not because she was too tired to hurry, but because hurrying felt like the wrong response to what was happening, which was something that deserved to be approached at the pace of its own weight. She stopped at the corral fence 6 meters from where he stood. A rider had come through. She knew this without asking because she could see it in the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had received news and had been living inside that news and was now being required to revise it. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have already grieved, with the compound expression of someone who is glad to be wrong and unsure yet what to do with the gladness. She had seen that expression twice before in her life, both times on the faces of people who had received news of a death and then received a correction. It was an expression that took time to resolve because it contained two states that were not entirely compatible with each other. He said, "Come inside." She led the gray to the water trough at the corner of the corral first. The trough had been kept open. There was a layer of ice around the edges where the temperature had been working at it, but the center was open water, and the gray dropped his head and drank slowly and steadily, in the way of an animal that has been moving all day in cold air and needs more water than he has been able to access. She stood with him while he drank. Callum stood at the barn door and watched her stand with the mule, and did not say anything about the delay, which told her something about him. The house was warm in the way that a house with a good stove burning all day is warm, not the residual warmth of a fire recently built, but a deep, even warmth that had had all day to penetrate the walls and the furniture and the floor. The kind of warmth that met you at the threshold and continued through the room without diminishing in any corner. The smell was wood smoke and something beneath wood smoke, coffee and pine resin from the walls. And the smell she had learned to associate with houses where a person lived alone for an extended period, a particular combination of order and stillness that was not unpleasant, but that was specific and recognizable. Callum went to the corner of the room where a pair of boots hung from a peg in the wall, not on the floor but hung up, which was the way you stored boots that were not in regular use, that you were keeping rather than using. They were women's boots, tall, brown leather, the kind made to last, the kind that showed significant wear on the soles, increasing at the toe box from years of use that had bent the leather to the specific shape of the foot that wore them. He took them down from the peg, held them for a moment, not with ceremony, just with the pause of a man making a decision he had not specifically prepared for, and set them on the floor near the stove, toes pointing toward the room. His wife Maren had been dead 2 winters. Idella knew this from a letter that had come the previous spring, brief and factual, conveying the essential information and asking nothing of its recipient. She had written back with the same brevity. The Crane family had never found elaborate expression of large things to be natural to them. Their father had expressed grief by going to look at the thing that had caused it and understanding it as precisely as possible. And his children had inherited some version of this translated into their own particular approaches to what could not be fixed and had to be carried instead. She sat on the bench near the stove and looked at the boots for a moment, at the wear pattern, at the shape the leather had taken, at the way a life spent in this country showed itself in the specific forms of damage and adaptation that objects accumulated. Then she unlaced her own boots, the ones she had worn for 6 days, without removing the leather, stiffened and darkened with everything the 6 days had put into them. She set them aside. She put on Maren's boots. They were close enough to her size, not exact, but the difference was small enough that the warmth the stove had put into the leather was the primary sensation, and the primary sensation was sufficient. She sat with that warmth for a long moment. Callum did not speak. She did not speak. The stove ticked with the small sounds of metal expanding in heat. Outside, the wind that had been absent all day found the eaves, briefly tested them, let go. Callum poured coffee from the pot on the stove, a pot that had been on the stove all day, which meant the coffee was strong in the way of coffee that has been doing nothing but becoming more itself for several hours. He set a cup in front of her and sat across the table with his own cup held in both hands, the way their father had held his coffee on cold mornings, and he waited. He had always been a patient waiter, Callum. She had noticed this about him even when they were children. His capacity to wait without the waiting being oppressive, to be present and quiet without filling the quiet with something that did not belong in it. She told him. She had been deciding what to tell him for 4 days, not in the sense of deciding what to omit or conceal, but in the sense of deciding what the story actually was, what its shape was, where it started and where it ended, and what the essential elements were that gave it its shape. She had arrived at a version by the third day south, walking through the features of it in her head, while she walked through the snow on her feet, testing the sequence, finding the places where the sequence required explanation and the places where it did not. She told him that version, not the complete inventory of every decision and every repair and every hour of the 19. There was a version of the story that contained all of that, and it was not the version for this conversation. She told him the version that contained the essential structure, the wall of cloud from the northwest, the stopped wind, the three walls already built by the rock, the fourth wall she had built from what was available, the principle her father had taught her when she was 9 years old on a headland in Maine, the 19 hours, the morning after. He listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup and he looked at the table and he listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment in the way of someone who is not choosing to be quiet, but who has arrived at a place where quiet is the natural response to what they have just received. Then he looked at her. "Father was teaching you the whole time," he said. "You just didn't know what for." She did not answer. There was nothing to add to it. He had named the thing precisely. She picked up her coffee cup and drank. The coffee was strong and very hot, and it tasted of nothing remarkable. And she held it in both hands the way he held his, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. And the stove ticked, and the afternoon went gray outside the window, and the warmth of the room continued to be what it was. After a while, Callum got up and went to the kitchen area and came back with a plate. Bread and a thick slice of salt pork that had been in the pan at some point during the day and had been set aside still warm enough to matter. He set it in front of her without comment and sat back down with his coffee. She ate without ceremony, with the focused attention of someone who has been calculating food intake against expenditure for a week and is now presented with food that has no calculation attached to it. The bread was dense and slightly sour, and it was the best bread she had eaten in 4 months, which was not because it was particularly good bread, but because it was bread she had not rationed. She stayed. Through the rest of that November and through December, when the cold settled in for its sustained winter work, and the ranch required the kinds of daily attention that a place required in winter. The feeding and the watering and the fence checking and the wood splitting and the tasks that generated more tasks in the way that winter generated more winter. Through January, when a brief thaw came and went and left behind the particular misery of refreeze, and through February, which was the worst month on the calendar in that country, the month when winter had been going on long enough that everything it required of you had been depleted and it was still going on. Through March, when the first real signs of the season turning appeared in the way the light changed before the temperature did the angle of the afternoon sun, shifting the shadows, shortening the sky, taking on a quality that was not yet spring, but was no longer entirely winter. Callum did not ask her to stay past November. He did not ask her to stay at all. He mentioned in late November that the east fence needed work before the spring, and that he had been putting it off because the work was easier with 2 people than with 1. He mentioned in December that he had been thinking about increasing the cattle operation in the spring, and that this would require more consistent attention to the winter management of the current herd than he had been giving it. He mentioned these things with the same matter-of-fact quality with which he mentioned everything without inflection or implication, and she received them with the same quality, and the arrangement came into existence between them without either of them having explicitly proposed or accepted it. She repaired the east fence in late March using techniques her father had taught her for working with limited materials, splicing wire the way he had spliced rope, finding the structural logic of the existing fence and reinforcing it rather than replacing what the winter had damaged, leaving the fence not new but sound. She found in the doing of it that she was good at this kind of work in a way she had not known, the same way she had found on the trail that she could read snow surfaces and navigate by sun angle capacities that had been present without her knowing they were present, waiting for the situations that would make them apparent. The story of what she had done on the Bowman Trail moved through the settlement around Buffalo in the way that useful things move through communities that needed useful things, not written down, not announced, but present, carried from one conversation to another as something worth carrying. She did not tell it herself after the first telling to Callum and the second to the family at the neighboring ranch. After that, it moved without her, which was the way she preferred it. She heard it come back to her in fragments the way things come back when they have been through enough tellings to lose the particular details and retain only the structural ones. A woman alone, a wagon, a hole in the rock, four walls with no gaps. She heard through this neighbor's husband that the story had reached Billings. More specifically, that it had reached Orson Hatch, carried there by a buyer who had stopped in his store in the second week of December. The neighbor's husband was not a man who paid close attention to the emotional responses of storekeepers in Billings and had no particular detail to offer about what Hatch had made of the information. What he reported was that Hatch had listened to the full account without speaking, and that when the buyer finished, Hatch had asked one question, the neighbor's husband did not know what question, and that after the answer, Hatch had gone to the back of the store and not returned while the buyer was present. Adela thought about this for several days after hearing it. She thought about it the way she thought about mechanisms, trying to understand the logic of the thing, the forces acting on it, what it revealed about the structure beneath. Orson Hatch had made a calculation in October standing in her yard with his ledger looking at a woman with a toolbox and a worn mule and 225 kilometers of November trail between her and the nearest relative. The calculation had been reasonable given the information available to him. The information available to him had not included a 9-year-old girl on a headland in Maine with a father who taught her specific things and expected her to retain them. The calculation had been wrong. He knew it was wrong now. What a man of Hatch's particular character did, with the knowledge that a calculation was wrong, was revise the calculation. He would not undo the ledger. The ledger was accurate. The numbers were what they were. The house and the cattle and the table with the uneven leg were gone and would remain gone. But the calculation about the woman who had walked away from those things would be revised. Quietly, privately in the back of his store in Billings. The revision would not produce any action she would ever see. It did not need to. December came again, not the December of the storm, but the one that followed it, a year and more. Past the blizzard. Now the second December since the Bowman Trail. The winter this year was cold in the ordinary way of Wyoming winters, rather than in the extraordinary way of the previous year, requiring attention and preparation, but offering nothing dramatic in return, the cold performing its seasonal function without any particular emphasis. She had been on the ranch for more than a year. She had repaired the east fence and learned the cattle and split more wood than she had split in the previous 5 years combined, and she was not the person who had left Billings in October of 1887, and she had not been that person for some time. One evening in the middle of that December, a wind came down from the northwest. Not a blizzard, not anything close to a blizzard. A real wind, a cold wind, the kind that found the gaps in buildings and reminded you that winter was still the prevailing condition of the world outside the walls that kept it outside. It found the window of the room Callum had given her, the small room at the back of the house with a west-facing window, and rattled it. She had been asleep. The sound woke her. She lay still and listened to the wind working at the window frame, finding a gap she had noticed in early December, and packed with rope fiber from the outside. The same rope fiber, the same method applied to a window in a house, rather than a gap between wagon box and sandstone wall. But the principle was identical. The rope fiber was doing what it had been placed to do. The window did not rattle further. The gap did not widen. The room remained warm. She sat up. She put her feet into Marin's boots, which she had kept wearing, because they fit, and because they were good boots, and because she thought sometimes wearing them was a way of acknowledging that Marin had lived in this house and had worked in this country and had been a person worth remembering, even by someone who had never met her. She crossed to the window. Outside, the wind was moving the upper branches of the cottonwood at the corner of the corral. She could see them against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, bending in the gusts, and recovering in the intervals between them, bending and recovering with the ease of things built to accommodate force rather than resist it. Below the cottonwood, the corral fence was solid and still. The barn beyond it was dark and still. The country beyond the barn was dark and white and still, the snow surface showing the faint silver of starlight breaking through the overcast in patches. The landscape lying under its winter covering, as it had been lying for weeks and would continue to lie for months. She had not outlasted the blizzard. She had made herself something the wind couldn't find. She stood at the window and let the thought settle the way you let something settle when it has arrived after being on its way for a long time, and you want to give it the attention it is due. She had been on its way for more than a year. The blizzard had been its occasion, the event that had required her to use everything she had been given by a man who was 9 years dead, and whose specific instruction had arrived when she needed it, with the accuracy of something stored correctly in the place where it was needed. But the blizzard was not the whole of it. The whole of it was the year since the blizzard, the months of work, and the fence in March, and the cattle in summer, and the December that was ordinary rather than extraordinary, the December that did not require her to build a wall from scrap in 30 minutes or die. The ordinary December was the vindication of the extraordinary one. She was here for an ordinary December. She had gotten here by being the kind of person who could survive the extraordinary one. She put her hand flat against the window frame, her palm against the pine cold conducted through the wood, from the outside air, the grain of it just perceptible through her skin. The wind moved in the cottonwood branches. They bent and came back. She held her hand against the wood and felt the cold of the outside moving through it, meeting the warmth of the inside at the surface of the frame, meeting the warmth at the seal she had packed with rope fiber, meeting it and finding no way through. She took her hand back. She turned and went to bed. In the spring of 1888, when the Bowman Trail opened and the snow retreated from the high ground in the grudging, uneven way that snow retreated from Wyoming, a survey party working the Powder River Basin came across the sandstone formation in Section 14, Township 52 North Range, 83 West. They found the wagon box buried to its sideboards in the last of the season's snow. The snow that had accumulated against it during the storm and frozen and compressed and remained through the winter months as a solid mass rather than drifting away. The weight of it holding the box in place even as the ground around it softened in the warming weeks. Above the box, attached to the rock overhang with stones wedged into crevices, a length of canvas hung stiff and discolored. The ice that had formed on its outer surface during the storm, having melted and reformed several times since leaving the fabric impregnated with minerals leached from the sandstone. In the gaps at each side of the wagon box, the grass packing that had been pushed into place by numb hands and failing light was still present, most of it still frozen solid at its core, bound by the ice that had formed in the moisture of the stems during the first hour of the storm and had not fully released since. The survey party's notes described it as an abandoned structure of unknown origin and unknown purpose. They recorded its location with the precision their work required. Section Township Range, bearing from a known monument 2 kilometers to the south, and they moved on because their work was to describe the country as it was, not to speculate about the history of what they found in it. The following winters worked on the wagon box in the patient way that Wyoming winters worked on everything made of wood, the freeze and thaw cycles opening the grain, the moisture getting in the nails, losing their hold as the wood swelled and shrank around them. The canvas went first, the fibers breaking down from the inside out, the material returning to something closer to soil than cloth by the second winter. The rope fiber dissolved, the grass packing scattered with the spring winds. After the second winter, the stems finally releasing from the frozen core that had held them since November of 1887. By the third winter after the survey party, there was nothing left in the alcove that had not been there before Idella Crane arrived at it on the afternoon of November 6, 1887. Only the 3 walls of sandstone and the dry floor and the ledge of rock that had kept everything beneath it dry for 10,000 years and would continue to keep it dry for 10,000 more. The story did not return to the ground with the wagon box. It moved through the settlements around Buffalo and along the Powder River and eventually into the conversation of people who had never been within 50 kilometers of the section. 14 formation moved the way. Practical knowledge moved through communities that depended on practical knowledge for survival, which was without formality and without the kind of deliberate transmission that required a teacher and a student facing each other with the explicit understanding that something was being taught. It moved through the telling of it in kitchens and barns, in trading posts, in the interiors of line shacks during the long and active periods of winter, told sometimes accurately and sometimes with the variations that accumulated with distance and time. The woman in it, sometimes younger or older. The wagon, sometimes larger or smaller. The storm, sometimes longer or shorter. But 4 elements remained fixed in every version told in every venue, where the story was told for as long as anyone could remember hearing it. A woman alone, a broken wagon, a hole in the rock, four walls with no gaps. People remembered it not because the principle it contained was new. Anyone who had lived in that country for more than one serious winter had learned some version of the principle, had learned that wind was the thing and stillness was the defense, had learned that the completeness of a barrier mattered more than its strength. They remembered it because the story was specific, because it named a particular woman making particular decisions with particular materials in a particular place on a particular day in November. And the particularity was what made it carry. Abstract principles were forgotten. Specific stories were kept. The specificity of this one, the wagon box, the grass, the BTS, the rope harness, the 40 minutes, the 19 hours, was what allowed it to do what her father had spent his life doing, which was to transmit knowledge that could be used. The knowledge was this look at what is already there, not at what you wish were there, not at what would be there if the situation were different, not at what would be sufficient if it were sufficient, at what is actually present, broken or whole, designed for this purpose or not designed for any purpose at all. Look at it with clear eyes and see what it can do. Then do the work of making it complete, every gap attended to, every joint packed, nothing left open to what is coming through. The blizzard doesn't stop. It runs out of ways in. And when it does, you are still there on the other side of it with whatever you carried through.